All right, friends, we are getting started today. We are in the third chapter, verse 4, and we're going to try and cover a pretty good chunk today, maybe even get through verse 10, which sounds like a challenge, is certainly maybe a bigger chunk than we've normally done, a faster pace. But this, Michael, this is a fairly repetitive section. John says the same thing here in a number of ways. And maybe to preface this, we should have some conversation about John's understanding and vocabulary regarding sin.
Yeah, right. So you got to remember that in John's writing, Jesus Christ is the revealed Son of God, perfect in every way. And the light of Christ reveals the corresponding darkness in us. And sin is the fundamental shared equation in every human spirit. The darkness is the place where we all start, and we actively resist the revelation of Christ. That's why John has this language between the world. You know, the world is always an enemy of Christ because the darkness resists that light. And so sin is this thing that is an inescapable starting point, and really, ultimately, the hurdle we have to get over to recognize the revelation of Christ.
And do you think it's fair to say that in John, particularly in this chunk of verses that we're going to read, sin is very practical? In other words, this isn't a theological concept of being sinners like we might encounter it in the Reformed Church. This is an action or a course that is directly opposed to what Christ hopes to accomplish in the world, specifically perhaps unity most of all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have to start this passage here, Clint, because if you come to this text looking for a menu of sins, and maybe you're even looking for an order of which sins place higher than others in a ranking of what's worst, you're going to be missing the thrust of this argument. John is responding in a situation in which John believes this community is being schismed or ripped apart because of fundamental choices, actions, words that are causing a rift in that community. And for John, there is no greater sin than the sin of dividing the Church of Christ.
Right. So I think that's helpful. Keep that in mind as we go here. We will try to stop and talk about this. We'll have ample opportunities to do that. But maybe the best way to understand it is to get into it. So let's go verse 4 here. Everyone who commits sin is guilty of lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. You know that he was revealed to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. Now, at this point, Michael, classic John thinking, right. Everything good. So now we continue. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has either seen him or known him. And this is where we probably gulp a little bit and do a double take, and we begin to try and wrestle with what John is saying here.
Yeah, once again, let's get less focused on counting sins and saying, well, wow, I've sinned, so I don't fit here. This is far more that the actions that we choose that have direct implications on our ability to remain in unity and fellowship. So I think we need to be thinking here, where have we had opportunities for reconciliation that we've not pursued? In what ways have we put ourselves at the center and therefore thrust others out? This is the kind of sin that cannot coexist with abiding in Christ. Abiding in Christ means selflessly, humbly giving ourselves so that others might experience the love and grace of Christ. And when we fail to do that, we're participating in the kind of sin that schisms here.
Yeah, and so I think, Michael, tell me if you agree with this, that I think it's fair to say that John has in mind here specifically sins that destroy community.
Right.
That are destructive to fellowship. So, verse 7, little children, let no one deceive you. Everyone who does what is right is righteous, just as he is righteous. Everyone who commits sin is a child of the devil. For the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The Son of God was revealed for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. And again, not to beat this into the ground, y'all, but just to understand that these are the kind of verses that could easily be used as a club if you don't understand what John is saying. John has in mind here sin being that thing which destroys a church, that thing which is divisive and separates people from one another, and sometimes does so under the guise of Christ. And he's saying that's never true. That is never Jesus. It is never Jesus that harms relationships and breaks people apart. That's not the work of Christ in the world. That's the work of the devil.
And that's well said, Clint. The only thing I would add to that, friends, is when John starts talking about the devil, you should know this is serious language. It is even today. We know, wow, this is a serious offense being talked about. Satan, the devil, is the antithesis of the Christ, where Christ is the revelation of God's love. Satan is the living personification of division, of divisiveness, even in the heavenly places. So let's not get fundamentally wrapped up in trying to figure out the person, the devil, like you're trying to get a sketch of what this person looks like. That was the child, the physical child. No, what this is trying to emphasize is how serious of a topic this is, of how antithetical this is to the revelation of Christ.
Yeah, and against the backdrop of the week that we've had, I find John incredibly helpful here. The reminder or the idea that the fundamental work of evil is to separate, people from God and godly people from one another. That the work of the devil, we think sometimes that the devil is just trying to trick us into messing up. That's a far too anemic way to imagine evil. The point of evil is to sow separation between anything God-based, God and people, people and each other. And that is the work that evil seeks to engage in the world. And I find this obviously a moment where this language resonates very strongly, and I think we're indebted to John for a picture like that.
I hope that we can have the courage, Clint, to use this as a mirror and an invitation for self-reflection and not a club. Fundamentally, the thing that makes sin and lawlessness so dangerous, Clint, is that it will flow out of our own heart. And that means our own misaligned passions or our things that we think are good, but yet we, for whatever reason, have miscalculated or misidentified or just simply not known. But the thing that makes sin dangerous, Clint, isn't that it's some external force besetting us, but that we can easily inculcate it in ourselves, even sometimes not knowing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said, Michael. So then we move to verse 9 here. Those who have been born of God do not sin because God abides in them. God's seed abides in them. They cannot sin because they have been born of God. And again, we all know experientially that this isn't a literal verse. Those of us who seek to follow Christ know this isn't to be convicting in the sense of, I lost my temper with my family yesterday, so I guess I'm not born of God.
Right.
That's not what this is about. This is an encouragement to constantly and continually seek to orient our life toward the unity and the peace and the truth that we find in Jesus Christ because we have been born of God. And I think the word because there is actually very important.
Another important word in that section there is this phrase, being born of God. This is a very Johannine word, and it's something that we see in the gospel, even this conversation that Jesus has with Nicodemus about how can I be born again? Friends, the image of birth is actually a helpful one. Birth is literally a new start. It is literally life becoming. And that is what's given to us, is the invitation to new life. But let us not forsake the reality that birth is difficult and challenging, and in some cases, we must mourn deadly. And I think that's a beautiful way to frame this here, is that we are invited to be born of God, and that fresh new start can change everything.
Yeah, and again, that idea, we discussed it at length yesterday, of abiding, remaining in God, protects us from sin because it dislocates or replaces in us our self-centeredness and our selfish drive, and instead provides a new orientation toward the work of God and the work of Christ in the world. And then this culminates in verse 10. The children of God and the children of the devil are revealed in this way. All who do what is right, all who do not do what is right are not from God, nor are those who do not love their brothers and sisters. And here, this is wonderful, Michael, because on one hand, John complicates it and simplifies it all at the same time. That those who do not do what is right are not from God, which sounds like an invitation to legalism, which sounds like an invitation to self-righteousness, except he tags this incredible thing on the end of it, nor are those who do not love their brothers and sisters. And as we see in John, we saw in Jesus, that love is the ultimate litmus test of faith. Those who love understand what it is to be loved. Those who have been loved in Christ understand that it becomes then their calling to share that love with others.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's well said, Clint. We would all do well to prayerfully invite God to teach us love, because that word is so short and beyond ever reaching the end of its meaning. It is deep and rich and mysteriously encompasses the whole gospel. That God so loved the world is John's language in the gospel. And yet here, we who abide, we who have God's life living in us, we are called to live by the same measure by which Jesus Christ lived his life. And if that is not encouraging and challenging at the same time, we've misunderstood it.
100%. And so if I think, again, there's lots of language in this passage that is difficult and it sounds strange. And in some ways, the words like righteousness and sin are used differently than the Reformed tradition or has used them, or maybe we tend to use them in church. But I think if there's a takeaway here, maybe it's this, Michael, that ultimately sin is what separates and love is what unites, what unifies. And as people of Christ, we are called to live lives of unifying love, because that's what we experienced through Christ in God's love.
I hope that you've found something in today's conversation helpful, friends. We had a little bit of a run up to our conversation today, Clint, but I do think tomorrow is a missed day. So we might want to let people know that.
Yeah, just make sure if you're still listening, if you're still with us, we are not going to be able to meet tomorrow. We have some schedule stuff working for both of us at the same time. And so you get a Friday off, which I promise Monday we'll come back, and we've got some really good stuff. And part of the reason we wanted to get extra verses in today is 3-day weekend for everybody on Bible study. If you want to read ahead, that would be great. Thanks for being here. There may be questions. Again, some of this is not easy, so if you have thoughts or questions, we'd certainly be willing to try and respond to them. If not, we hope that you guys have a wonderful day, a great weekend, and we'll see you Monday. I'll ask Megan to send a reminder email out, so you should get word again.
Thanks, everybody. Good to have you with us.